How are you, Africa? My name is Moses Tofa. Welcome to Pan-Africanism Through Poetry with Moses Tofa. Today's poem is titled, Why I No Longer Blame Imperialists, Supremacists, Racists, but Africans. Africa, you went through the twin evils of slave trade and colonialism. You fought so hard and gained political independence. But tragically, close to 70 years into independence, you are still under the stranglehold of imperialism. You are still the poorest continent in the world, despite that you are blessed with abundant natural resources. You are the world's most despised and disrespected continent. Why is this so, Africa? Where did you go wrong? Africa, when you gained political independence, your greatest task was to have brutal conversations around the following pillars. What are the factors that made it possible for you to be enslaved and colonized? What are the tools that were used by the colonialists to enslave and colonize you? How are these tools repackaged and deployed in the post-colonial era? What is the nature and extent of damage that slave trade and colonialism imposed on you? How can you address colonial injustices in a sound, systemic, universal, and coordinated way? How can you protect yourself against imperialism? What is the direction that you aspire to take as a continent? How can you unite, connect, and trade with each other? How can you relate and trade with other nations as a united bloc? How can you meaningfully compete with other civilizations? How can you use your resources to take you to the mountaintop? How can you become economically and militarily powerful? What kind of leadership and governance architecture that you should adopt? How can you liberate your education system from colonialism? What are the things that your education system must teach? What are the values, ideas, and aspirations that define and unify you? And how are you going to protect and promote those values and aspirations? What is your key message to the global community? And how are you going to build a united and respected voice among the community of nations? Africa, I am afraid to tell you that as far as these conversations are concerned, you failed yourself. Africa, let me confess to you today that for a long time, I predominantly blamed imperialists, supremacists, and racists for causing your problems. However, after some deep reflections, I have come to the realization and conclusion that it is now time to blame you, Africa. Africa, you deserve the disrespect that is directed against you because you have failed to respect yourself. How can other civilizations respect you when you are standing on the pinnacle of natural endowment but rely on handouts from the very civilizations that are plundering you? This is why I no longer blame imperialists, supremacists, and racists, but Africans. At this point, allow me to tell you a tale of two statements. One statement by civil society organizations in Zimbabwe, and another statement by the Chinese embassy in Zimbabwe. On the 20th of January 2022, civil society organizations in Zimbabwe wrote a joint statement stating that, I quote, "We, the Zimbabwe civil society groups, united in our common objective to defend our communities and national heritage against investment projects that disempower and impoverish our people, seek to register our deep concern with the behavior of Chinese business operations in Zimbabwe. Our joint statement is not meant to defame China or trigger xenophobic resentment towards Chinese nationals in Zimbabwe. On the contrary, we seek fair and mutually beneficial relations between the two countries. We have, however, noted with deep concern the threats of displacements and mining projects in ecologically sensitive places around the country without any due regard for the concerns of the local people. Close quote. As you can see, this statement raised a legitimate concern in a measured way. But on the 24th of January 2022, the Chinese embassy in Zimbabwe responded to this statement with a disparaging statement, stating that, I quote, "Were it not for China's funding support and the work of Chinese companies in ICT and power generation, even the statement in question would perhaps have to be scribbled on a piece of paper in a candlelit room and never find its way on a functioning internet." Close quote. As you can see, this is a highly arrogant and condescending response. It is a savage attack on Africa and Africans, which reinforces the view that without colonialism, Africa would still be living in the dark. I'm sure that you will not believe me if I were to tell you that this disparaging statement by the Chinese embassy was published in the Herald, the main state-owned newspaper in Zimbabwe, a newspaper which many Zimbabweans are not allowed to use to express their ideas. I do not blame the Chinese for this, because this is what happens to a people who do not respect themselves. They cannot expect to be respected by others. Today, Zimbabweans are displaced from their ancestral land to allow foreign companies to exploit their natural resources. It is unutterably painful to imagine that it is never possible, either in this age or in the age to come, for Zimbabwean companies operating in China, if at all they can, to evict the Chinese from their land and exploit China's natural resources. But it is a norm for Chinese companies operating in Zimbabwe to evict Zimbabweans from their ancestral land and carry out state-sanctioned haste. Africa, this is why I no longer blame imperialists, supremacists, and racists, but Africans. As recently as January 2024, Zimbabweans were shocked when two anchors on the Good Morning Zimbabwe show of the Zimbabwe Broadcasting Corporation, Zimbabwe's national broadcaster, said that colonialism was a necessary evil because without it, Zimbabweans would not be appearing on television, and that they would be clothed in animal skin and playing traditional drums with their bare hands. I do not blame these anchors, but I blame you, Africa. Because this is a systemic problem that must be addressed systemically. What have you done to uproot the legacies of colonialism? Africa, this is why I no longer blame imperialists, supremacists, and racists, but Africans. Africa, you are endowed with all the riches of storytelling. But close to 70 years into independence, you do not have one international television channel that tells your stories in the way you want them to be told. A channel that gives you a voice among the community of nations. A channel that challenges and exposes false narratives about Africa. A channel that exposes foreign activities and interference in Africa. But all you do is to complain when other nations say that you are a dark continent, you are a hopeless continent, and that you are a scar that is not able to heal itself. You complain that other nations are not covering your stories. Why do you want your stories to be covered by other nations? Do you not know that stories that are told by others are in the danger of being falsified? Do you not know that if others tell your story, they will define you? Do you not know that the world is defined and driven by narratives? Africa, as long as you are not able to tell your stories, you will never be able to set the agenda. And you will never be able to challenge the imperialistic narrative and turn its tide. Africa, as long as Africans aspire to be admitted in the magnificent but diabolical edifice of white supremacy, they do not have the moral authority to demand the eradication of supremacism and racism. Because this aspiration in and of itself is an endorsement of supremacism. As long as Africans aspire to be emptied of everything African and be repackaged with everything Western, they do not have the moral authority to demand the eradication of supremacism and racism. Africa, if I were an imperialist, racist, or supremacist, I would not respect any person in this age or in the age to come who is from another race, but whose lifetime aspiration is to discard his or her racial appearance and content to become a feigned version of me, when he or she is naturally different from me. I can never respect such a person, because at best, he or she can only become a feigned and inferior version of me. I can only respect a person who maintains a distinct, proud, authentic, and superior version of himself. Africa, if you are to ask any people to embrace and respect a feigned version of themselves, you will be asking for too much from them. Africa, this is why I no longer blame imperialists, supremacists, and racists, but Africans. Africa, I understand the permanent damage that colonialism has done to your mother tongues. I equally understand how impossible it is for you not to speak foreign languages. But let this truth be known unto you, Africa, that a people who look at their language with disdain and take other people's languages as their own because they believe that it is aristocratic for them and their children not to speak their own language, do not deserve to be respected by the very people whose language they appropriate. Africa, this is why I no longer blame imperialists, supremacists, and racists, but Africans. Africa, worshiping God is a divine duty, and it must be done orderly and soberly. If I were an imperialist, racist, or supremacist, I would not respect the people who turn mega factories into mega churches from which they pray for jobs and declare and decree miracle money, when the Bible teaches that we must work with our hands and minds for us to prosper. Africa, this is why I no longer blame imperialists, supremacists, and racists, but Africans. Africa, if you were once enslaved and colonized, and fought valiantly to free yourself from enslavement and colonialism, only for you to become a student of those who enslaved and colonized you yesteryear, and continue to enslave and colonize you today through politically correct means, then you are not worthy to be respected by the oppressor turned teacher. Africa, this is why I no longer blame imperialists, supremacists, and racists, but Africans. Africa, slave trade and colonialism taught you to hate the material with which you are made of. You fell for this self-hatred lecture, hook, line, and sinker. But political independence gave you the power to uproot all forms of self-hatred. But alas, close to 70 years into independence, you are still drowning in the sea of self-hatred and inferiority complex. Africa, you cannot blame imperialists for your failure to undo self-hatred and go back to your soul. You cannot look at yourself with disdain and expect others to look at you with love, dignity, and respect. Africa, this is why I no longer blame imperialists, supremacists, and racists, but Africans. Africa, how can your struggles and causes be funded and directed by the very forces that you claim to be fighting against? How can you fight struggles and causes that are based on sending proposals and receiving grants? How can you spend millions of dollars on convening conference whose agenda is to discuss your problems, instead of using a substantial amount of that money to actually solve your problems? Africa, this is why I no longer blame imperialists, racists, and supremacists, but Africans. Africa, I agree that it is important to excavate the territory of imperialism and discover all its hidden devices. However, blaming imperialists, supremacists, and racists will never resolve anything, because the responsibility to uproot imperialism, supremacism, and racism does not lie with imperialists, supremacists, and racists, but with the victims of imperialism, supremacism, and racism. In fact, the responsibility of imperialists is to defend imperialism, not to kill it. That is why they have vowed that the empire will never die. That is why they are using every ounce of strength to defend and keep imperialism alive. It is the duty of Africans to use every ounce of strength to kill imperialism. But they must understand that imperialism can never be killed by words, placards, or the deception of inclusion, but by the fiery swords of consciousness and revolutionary action. Africa, this is why I no longer blame imperialists, supremacists, and racists, but Africans. Africa, your leaders do not respect themselves and their own people. They are corrupt to the uttermost. They abduct, torture, and kill their citizens. They invest in the infrastructure of fear, repression, and exclusion, instead of investing in the infrastructure of ideas, inclusion, and development. They criminalize even the most basic forms of human expression. They steal elections in broad daylight. They always think about the next election and not the next generation. They aspire to die in office and to be succeeded by their kith and kin. They establish long-term agendas and dishonor them. They promise sunshine but deliver eerie darkness. They plunder national resources without a grain of compunction, because they see public office as an opportunity to eat and not to serve. They do not invest their plunder in their own nations. They fly abroad to get first-class medical treatment because their own health delivery systems are derelict. Many of them die in foreign hospitals. They send their children to private schools or foreign educational institutions because state-owned educational institutions are derelict. After all this, they expect to be respected by other nations. and they expect other nations not to plunder Africa. This is why I no longer blame imperialists, supremacists, and racists, but Africans. Africa, many of your citizens who have ideas do not contest for public office. They pride themselves as cutting-edge academics and analysts and sit on the terraces from which they bellow out their ideas, while people who are without ideas contest elections and assume public office. This is why the majority of African voters are accustomed to voting for people without ideas. For the few Africans who have ideas, who contest and get into public office, their intellect is not the guarantor that they will keep their official positions. They can only keep their positions on the condition that they are willing to become uttermost sycophants. This forces them to disappear their principles and intellect and lift their fists to extol their principles. What a cycle of tragedy it is. Africa, this is why I no longer blame imperialists, supremacists, and racists, but Africans. Africa, your people must never expect other civilizations to regard you as a continent of light when their aristocratic desire is to depart and seek to be granted citizenship by other nations because they believe that you are a dark place. If imperialists say that Africa is a dark place, would you blame them? Africa, this is why I no longer blame imperialists, supremacists, and racists, but Africans. Africa, you are as poor as you are today because your people have an insatiable appetite to seek individualistic arrival at the detriment of collective arrival. It is this appetite that has made the African political elite to be corrupt to the uttermost and has forced dejected African citizens to depart and seek a better life elsewhere with the delusional hope that they will be admitted into the supremacist edifice, an edifice that will never regard them as equal residents. Africa, you must always understand that a continent whose people see individual good as a rival and not collective good as a rival must never expect to be respected by those civilizations which understand that a rival is collective and not individualistic. It is only within the context of collective arrival that individualistic arrival is meaningful. This is why Kwame Nkrumah said that the arrival of Ghana is meaningless unless the rest of Africa arrives. True arrival resides in a society's collective consciousness and its undying commitment to always protect and promote collective arrival. Africa, you must always remember that collective arrival is the epitome of arrival. Individualistic arrival is always false, no matter how aristocratic it may outwardly appear. If I am to use Zvangu Zvaita, a parlance that is used in Zimbabwe to describe individualistic arrival, I would say that Zvangu Zvaita is not arrival. Because any arrival that is surrounded by wretchedness is as wretched as the wretchedness that surrounds it. Any rich people who enjoy to be celebrated by poor people are as poor as the poor people who celebrate them. But always remember that arrival is not a materialistic end. It is a consciousness end that takes a society to a collectively aspired social, political, and economic end. Any end that is arrived at without collective consciousness is like an end that is arrived at without a compass. Such an end is always bound to be a false one. Africa, your demand for equality, dignity, and respect must not only be based on the mere fact that you are human, but on your commitment and capacity to make your life human. This is because humans are not human because they are human, but they are human because of what they do to make their life human. Our natural humanity is not in itself humanity, but it is a gateway to humanity. That is why those human beings who believe that they are human only on account of their natural humanity are in the danger of living under inhuman conditions. That is why humanity is not static but progressive. That is why humanity is not absolute but competitive and comparative. But above all, humanity is premised on the purity of the values that we profess than on the quality of life that we acquire as individuals and nations. This is because in the final analysis, society is not nourished by its infrastructure or policed by its security agencies, but by its core values. A society is therefore human on account of these two non-negotiable pillars: the purity of its values and the quality of life that it delivers to its people. Africa, you have cried for a long time. You have blamed imperialism for a long time. But the truth is that there are many things that are within your power and capability that you have failed to do. And for this reason, I no longer blame imperialists, supremacists, and racists, but Africans. Africa, it is my hope that you will use this admonition to rise and shine. Thank you, Africa. This is Moses Tofa. Conversations with Africa. Pan-Africanism through poetry. Inspiring Africa, raising consciousness. Amanda!